Welcome to the ESA Junior Faculty Webinar Series, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. As always, we'll have two 20-minute presentations. They're going to be followed by 5-minute discussions, and if we have time, a few more minutes for questions. As most of you probably know already, we'll have an after party at the end. We normally use this extra time to ask more questions to the speakers as well as discussants and have a more in-depth conversation about the papers. And sometimes these conversations may lead to some discussions to topics beyond these papers. And I personally find these discussions quite interesting. And if you have time, please stick around and join us at this after party. Our first speaker today is Boon Han Koh, who is one of my amazing collaborators. Boon Han obtained his PhD from the University of Melbourne in 2018, where he also spent a year as a postdoc. He joined the University of East Anglia as a lecturer last year in 2019. His main research interests are in the fields of experimental and behavioral economics, with a focus on beliefs, gender, and experimental methodology. Today, he'll be presenting us his study, Attribution Biases, Gender, and Financial Compensation. Boon Han, whenever you are ready, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Just a second. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Okay. Good day, everyone. Thank you very much to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present at the webinar, and also thank you to Christine for agreeing to discuss our paper. So this paper I'm presenting is joint work with Nishvan Urkel and Lata Gangadharan. So it is well established that there remains persistent gender gaps in labor market outcomes such as wages and leadership. So this issue has attracted a lot of attention within economics. And some possible explanations include differences in preferences, differential performance evaluation, as well as institutional structure. So these are possible explanations for the observed gender gaps in labor market outcomes. So we focus on the issue of biases in performance evaluation, and we have two specific questions in mind. So first, we ask the question, are successes and failures of men and women evaluated differently? And second, we ask the question of what role do beliefs play in performance evaluation? Understanding the answers to these questions is important because gender biases in performance evaluation can lead to potentially differences or potential differences in the kind of credit that women get for the same choices they make or the same outcomes they have attained as compared to men. And this may in turn have adverse consequences on their labor market outcomes, such as their career progression, the kind of bonuses they receive, as well as their incentive to compete for leadership or promotion. So with this in mind, our paper is going to be focusing on decision-making in risky environments. So in such an environment, the outcomes of individuals or decision makers are going to be determined by a combination of their effort choices as well as luck. Now, what drives the outcomes, whether is it choices or luck, is not going to be observable to other individuals or other evaluators. So for the evaluators, for them to evaluate the decision makers for their outcomes, this requires them to form beliefs about what might be driving these outcomes. So to this end, we run lab experiments to collect data on prior and posterior beliefs. And the data on beliefs is going to allow us to achieve two things. So first of all, it's going to allow us to examine how evaluators are going to be updating their beliefs about decision makers based on their gender. And this is where we'll be building on existing literature, which has shown evidence that individuals hold biased beliefs in the attribution of outcomes. Now here we are interested in whether these attribution biases also depend on the decision maker's gender. Now, secondly, the data on beliefs will also allow us to identify the role that beliefs play in determining compensation decisions. Our experiment is going to be focusing on two decision-making environments, and that's basically the two key treatments in our experiment. And the treatments are going to be varying the relationship between the evaluator and the decision maker, and they're designed to mirror the kind of real-world interactions that may exist between the evaluator and the decision maker. So in the first environment that we consider is one where evaluators are completely passive and they're unable to influence the decision maker's payoffs. So one can think of examples such as employees or workers in firms. They often have to form beliefs about their managers' actions, and these beliefs may not necessarily be directly payoff relevant to the managers or superiors. The second environment that we consider is one where the evaluators are also able to directly influence the decision maker's payoffs. So examples include board members in or firms. Often they have to decide how much compensation senior management or CEOs should receive for their outcomes. Voters in a country often have to choose whether to re-elect a political leader. So this would be the environment that would mirror those kind of decision-making situations where beliefs will play a role in driving how the decision makers are going to be compensated for their outcomes. So one can also think of the first environment where evaluators are passive as our baseline treatment in our experiment because it serves as a simpler experiment to study attribution biases in terms of how individuals update beliefs or form their beliefs about the determinants of outcomes. So with these in background in mind, our experiment is going to allow us to answer two key research questions. First of all, when the determinants of outcomes, and here we're talking about the determinants of success or failure, when these determinants are not observable, we ask the question, are the beliefs formed affected by the gender of the decision makers? Second question is, consider the environment where evaluators are able to directly influence the decision makers' payoffs. We ask the question, what are the determinants of payoff adjustments? Are the evaluators' decisions in terms of their payoff adjustment decisions influenced by the decision makers' intentions? Okay, and that's going to be driven by beliefs about the actions taken, or are the payoff adjustment decisions going to be affected by the direct consequence or the outcomes of the decision makers' actions? Okay, in terms of, I'm going to give a brief overview of our experimental design. So our experiment design is built on our earlier work, which is a working paper right now, design a review. Here, the overarching experiment is one where the subjects are participating in an investment task, and they do this in groups of 3. Now, within each group, there is a decision maker, and I'm going to refer to the decision maker as a DM for the rest of the talk. The DM makes an unobservable investment choice in the experiment. And one can think of this as an effort choice that will affect the payoffs of the rest of the group members. In the experiment, the DM can choose between low effort or high effort, or low versus high investment, and the investment can lead to one of two possible outcomes. The investment can either succeed or it can fail. And the payoffs are such that high effort or high investment is more costly for the DM, but it increases the probability that there is a good outcome for the group and a high payoff for the group. So what this means is that the expected payoff is going to be higher for the DM if the DM chooses low effort, but the expected payoff is going to be higher for each group member if the DM chooses high effort. So there's a trade-off in terms of incentives for the DMs as well as the group members, depending on the DM's effort choice. Now, as alluded to earlier, we consider two key treatments which vary the relationship between the DM and the evaluators, which in this case are the rest of the group members. So in treatment NA, this is where there are no payoff adjustment. Members are passive and they simply state their beliefs about the DM's decisions. In treatment A, which is our payoff adjustment treatment, the members state their beliefs about the DM's decisions, but on top of that, they can also choose whether to give the DM a bonus or a penalty, and this decision is not going to lead to any personal costs to the members. So with a bit more detail in terms of how this design was implemented in the lab. So subjects come into groups into the lab, and they're told that they're going to be divided into groups of 3. So the first thing that you're asked to do is that all the subjects are asked to make investment decisions, assuming that they have been appointed into a role of the DM of the group. And so this means that we are basically eliciting the DM's investment decisions using a strategy method. Subjects face a series of investment decisions, okay, and for each investment choice, they have to choose between low investment and high investment. Following which, after all the subjects have made their investment decisions as DMs, we then reveal their groups and roles. And these groups and roles are actually predetermined at the beginning of the experiment. We reveal the groups and roles in a manner similar to that employed by Bordello et al. In the 2019 AER paper. So what happens is all the subjects see their group number as well as their role, so whether they are the DM or their group member, on the computer screen. Then subjects are asked to raise their hands when their group number is called out. Second, the DM of that group is then asked to loudly say here when their ID number is called. So what this means is that we reveal the gender of the DM in this discrete manner using the DM's voice. Now, on top of that, from this point onwards, on the members' decision screens, we use gender-specific pronouns whenever we refer to the DM. So what this means is that whenever, if the DM of a group is female, then we will use the pronouns she or her to refer to the DM. And if the DM is male, then we'll use the pronouns he or him. Now, after the groups and roles are revealed, okay, in both treatments, okay, we ask members to state their beliefs about the decisions taken by the DM in the first stage. So first of all, members are asked to state their prior beliefs on the likelihood that the DM has chosen higher fit. Then they are also asked to state their posterior beliefs of the likelihood that the DM has chosen higher fit, conditional on knowing that the investment has succeeded, so there's a good outcome, as opposed to knowing the investment has failed, there's a bad outcome. We incentivize our beliefs using the binarized scoring rule, which is incentive compatible, regardless of the subject's risk preferences. And in treatment A only, okay, on top of stating their beliefs, members are asked to choose whether they would like to increase or decrease the DM's payoffs by up to 100 ECU. The members' payoff adjustment decisions in this treatment, they do not incur any personal costs from the decision, so they can increase the DM's payoffs or they can impose a penalty, and this is not going to directly affect their own incentives or payoffs. And similarly, members are asked to state a payoff adjustment decision conditional on each possible outcome of the investment chosen by the DM. Okay, so that's the overview of the experimental design. Just a quick pause here. Does anyone have any questions about the experiment? Okay.
Somebody rose their hand, but Natalie Lee. I think Jan needs to allow them to ask the question.
Okay, maybe I could proceed, but is this a clarification question? If not, I will proceed.
You can put their question in the Q&A.
Okay.
And you can get to it at the end.
Yeah, I'll get to that in a bit. So I'll move on first. Yeah. Okay, so before I discuss the results, I'm going to sort of present an overview of the theoretical framework that helps guide our theoretical predictions. Because of our incentive structure, DM's decisions are motivated by social preferences. So DMs will choose high effort if they're sufficiently altruistic towards their group members. And members then update their beliefs upon observing the outcomes of the DM's decisions. Now, in treatment A, members' payoff adjustment decisions are going to be motivated by reciprocity. So what this means is that their reciprocal actions are going to be determined jointly by a combination of their beliefs about the DM's intention, so in this case, their beliefs about the DM's action, as well as the direct consequence of the DM's action itself, so the outcome of the investment. So the DM's outcome, that's the outcome of the investment, can have both an indirect effect, there is acting through the beliefs channel, as well as a direct effect. And the direct effect will be the direct effect of the outcome over and beyond the beliefs. So regardless of the relative strength of both the indirect and the direct effects, our model predicts that the members will reward DMs for a good outcome and punish them for a bad outcome. And what this implies is that in treatment A, where members have the opportunity to reward or punish the DM, DMs will have an incentive to choose higher effort on average in that treatment as compared to treatment NA, where the members are passive. So with this in mind, we go to our first set of results, okay? So we predict that DMs are going to choose high effort, okay, on average in treatment A than in treatment NA, and we expect this to manifest in terms of the members' prior beliefs. And our results reveal that this is indeed the case. Now, on the left-hand side panel, this is the percentage of DMs who choose high effort in treatment A and in treatment NA, respectively. Correspondingly, on the right-hand side panel is the members' average belief that the DM has chosen high effort in treatment A and in treatment NA, respectively. So the graph shows us two things. First of all, DMs are more likely to choose high effort when members are able to adjust their payoff in treatment A. Correspondingly, members also are more likely to believe that their DM is going to choose high effort in treatment A, where they are able to adjust the DM's payoffs as compared to treatment NA. So what about gender differences within each treatment? So what we predict was that members' prior beliefs are going to be higher for female DMs than for male DMs. And we draw this insight from existing literature, which showed that women tend to be more altruistic in dictator games, although the results are context dependent. Our results, in fact, show that this is not the case. So we find that male and female DMs are no different in their effort choices on average, right, regardless of treatment NA or treatment A. Correspondingly, members do not hold different prior beliefs towards males versus female DMs in each of the two treatments. So we don't find any differences in initial or prior beliefs towards the DMs, depending on the DM's gender. What about the evaluation of outcomes? How do members attribute the outcomes of DM to their choices versus luck? So in terms of predictions, so starting with treatment NA, we anticipate that there's going to be biased beliefs in the attribution of outcomes. Now, this insight is drawn from results in our previous work where we find such biases in a similar environment where members are passive. So it's very similar to our treatment NA. Now, in treatment A, where members have the ability to influence the DM's payoffs, our conjecture is that members, through their own actions, through their own payoff adjustment decisions, their ability to adjust the DM's payoffs, would have more control over the outcome of the investment. So what we predict is that the attribution biases may be reduced in treatment A if members feel that their evaluation of the DMs is also a reflection of how they evaluate themselves. So some form of self-serving biases could be creeping in treatment A, and therefore we should observe less attribution biases and closer to the Bayesian benchmark in treatment A than in treatment NA. Now, in terms of gender differences, we expect that the outcomes of female DMs are more likely to be attributed to luck than those of male DMs. And this insight is drawn from the psychology literature, which shows evidence of differences in the attribution of outcomes for men and women. So in terms of results, the paper presents detailed estimation results from the deviation from the Bayesian benchmark, and we adopt the approach that is introduced by Mobis et al. In their 2014 paper. Here, I'm just going to give a very brief summary of the key takeaways. Now, in treatment NA, where members are passive, what we find is that there is evidence of gender biases in the attribution of outcomes. We find that good outcomes of female DMs are attributed more to luck as compared to a Bayesian, but the bad outcomes of male DMs are attributed more to effort. Interestingly, when we move to treatment A, where members have the ability to adjust the DM's payoffs, we find no such attribution biases. In fact, there is no difference from a Bayesian in the attribution of good and bad outcomes for both female and male DMs. So the attribution biases disappear in treatment A. So this leads to a follow-up. Our next question is, what are then the implications of payoff adjustments, given that there are no biases in the attribution of outcomes in treatment A, where members can adjust the DM's payoffs? What we find is that in terms of bonus and penalty decision, bonuses are positive adjustments and penalties are negative adjustments, we still find gender differences. First up is that female DMs tend to receive lower bonuses on average than their male counterparts when they get a good outcome. At the same time, they also receive lower penalties than their male counterparts when they get a bad outcome. So why may this be the case? Now, if you remember from our theoretical framework, okay, our conjecture prediction is that bonus and penalty decisions are going to be shaped by both the members' evaluation of the DM's actions, okay, their posterior beliefs, as well as the outcomes. So we conjecture that the outcomes of the DM's investment decision can have both an indirect effect that is acting through beliefs, as well as a direct effect over and beyond beliefs. And this is acting on the payoff adjustment decisions. So when we look at our data, this is a plot, okay, pulling together both data from male and female DMs of payoff adjustment decisions on the vertical axis and members' posterior beliefs on the horizontal axis. We find that, in fact, there is evidence of both channels. So payoff adjustments are increasing in posterior beliefs. So what this means is that, remember, members are updating their beliefs in response to the outcomes. So the outcomes of the DM's investment choice is affecting their payoff adjustment through beliefs. On top of that, the outcome also has a direct effect on payoff adjustments over and beyond the beliefs channel, because what we find is that payoff adjustments are higher on average for good outcomes than for bad outcomes, even after controlling for beliefs. So that was the results when we pulled for both male and female DMs together. But when we separate the analysis by the gender of the DMs, we find a very interesting twist to the conclusion, the insights, the results. What we find is that payoff adjustments are still increasing in posterior beliefs for male DMs. Okay, so beliefs still matter in determining payoff adjustments for men, but for women, for female DMs, the payoff adjustments do not depend on the members' posterior beliefs at all. There is still the direct effect, but the indirect effect does not manifest for female DMs. So to conclude, okay, in our paper, we find evidence of gender biases in the attribution of outcomes. Even though there is no differences in prior beliefs, the good outcomes of women are attributed more to luck, but bad outcomes are attributed more to effort. Nonetheless, none of these biases in attributions are observed when evaluators can make payoff adjustments. Yet, okay, even though the attribution biases go away, we still find gender differences in bonuses and penalties. And what we find interesting was that the determinants of payoff adjustments in terms of bonuses and penalties are different for men and women. While outcome matters for both men and women, beliefs about intentions, beliefs about the actions only matter for men. So what this implies is that men and women may actually be receiving different bonuses or penalties, even if the evaluators are holding the same beliefs about them. And what this could imply from our analysis seems to be suggesting that good outcomes would be a necessary condition for women to get a bonus or to get a high bonus. But for men, they can get a high bonus even if they attain a bad outcome, as long as evaluators hold them in high regard. In other words, they can get a bad outcome, but so long as evaluators have high beliefs towards them, they may still be able to get a high bonus or get a positive payoff adjustment. Okay, that's the end. Thank you very much for paying attention.
Thank you, Boon Han. Now we'll have Christine Exley from Harvard Business School. She's going to be discussing this paper for us.
All right. Just take a minute to get my slides. Okay, right. So I'm delighted to discuss this paper today. I think it's great. The way that I see it is that there's a lot of work on gender differences and beliefs about ability. So we can think of the confidence literature, which often focuses on beliefs about my own ability. We can think of the discrimination literature, which often focuses on the beliefs about others. There's notably less work on differences in beliefs about how men versus women behave in contexts where ability plays less of a role. So I think one thing that's really nice about this design is it's just a simple choice between two investment options. It's not, say, responding to an IQ question. There is some work that the authors also mentioned in their paper that shows that women are often believed to be perhaps nicer. And then really where this paper sits is, like, I think even in a smaller literature, which is considers this latter context where ability per se doesn't play a role, but they're also thinking about updating, not just level of belief. So I think that's a really nice contribution. So I just have 2 quick comments and 2 quick questions. So one comment is, since I see the potential contribution of this paper sitting so nicely in that updating space, it would really be nice to look at beliefs from realized outcomes as opposed to using the strategy method. I obviously understand the advantages of the strategy method. It gives you better power, for instance, but that might be worth considering if there's different psychological mechanisms, particularly, that might be at play here. It could even be that your results are stronger when you do that. The second comment is the decisions that the decision makers are making really involves a choice between a generous, safer option and a selfish, riskier option. We know that there's gender stereotypes and sometimes gender differences, both in pro-social behavior, how generous I am, but also in how risk averse I am. So depending on one approach is that we don't really care which one of these stereotypes is influencing our outcomes, which could be reasonable, but I think another interesting approach could try to be to separate between them. For instance, maybe people are just making a decision between a nice and a selfish outcome, but then there's a noisy signal that people are going to update about that in response to. All right, so turning to the questions, the first one that I love more on, and it's a short talk, so you can only do so much, but it's just telling us more about the raw data. I think I'm particularly interested in that for the posterior beliefs. Like, how about just the average difference in posterior beliefs, even if I just ignore what updating would imply? I think it'd also be cool to learn more about the distributions. Does it seem like the differences in beliefs about men and women are like generally a little bit different kind of by everyone, or are there some people with really extreme beliefs? What can we learn from thinking about some of that? The second comment is they have some nice experimental variation. So the decision makers make 5 different decisions, and then beliefs are elicited for each of these investment decisions. It'd be great to exploit that a little bit more. Do gender differences or beliefs about gender differences exist for more of these investment decisions relative to some? What does that tell us about the type of context that matters? And also, are there certain types of people who always attribute everything to luck, who always attribute everything to effort, so on and so forth? So those are my 2 comments, the 2 questions. You all can handle the Q&A time as you want. Maybe if you want to start with those questions, feel free, but also can take questions from the audience, I assume. Thanks much.
Thank you so much, Christine, for a great discussion of this paper. Boon Han, would you like to take a minute to respond?
Great. Thank you, Christine, for the comments. I took down as much of the notes as I can, but maybe we'll have a lengthier discussion during the after party. So one of the things is the strategy method. I thought that was a really good point. I guess here we're talking about a difference between hot and cold response. And I agree with you. I think with a hot response where there is realized outcome, we may find different results. In terms of ex-ante conjecture, my sense would be the hot responses where they actually see the realized outcome instead of using a strategy method could potentially exacerbate any attribution biases. And your point on risk, I think that's a really good point. We haven't actually gone into that. The reason why we thought about a risky environment is where that's one where both luck and actions play a role in driving outcomes. So when you observe the outcomes, you don't actually know what the determinants are. But you're absolutely right. I think risk would also play a role as well, because especially with gender differences in risk preferences as documented in the literature.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have a minute, and if there are any questions from the audience, Natalie asked a question and Nishvan responded to that question. But if there are any other questions from the audience, maybe I can ask a clarifying question quickly. How did you said that you communicated the gender using gender pronouns. How did you get that information at the beginning of the experiment so that you can use that later on?
Yeah, so what we actually did was when we invited participants to sign up for the experiments, we sent an online questionnaire that collected demographic variables. And then at the end of the questionnaire, we issued them an ID number. And the ID number, the beginning of the 6-digit ID number varies based on their gender, their reported gender. And then when they came into the lab, we asked them to enter their ID number that they have, and that allowed us to identify their reported gender right at the start.
Okay, that's actually pretty good. So you didn't have to prime them at the beginning of the experiment.
Yeah, so we wanted there to be a bit of a gap between the actual experiment and when they reported their gender as well.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
We're out of time. I'll yield the floor to Yan.
Okay. Thank you, Bilal. So it's my pleasure to introduce the second speaker, Shagata Mukherjee. Shagata got his PhD from Georgia State, and he's now an assistant professor at Meghnad Desai Academy of Economics. He also has a joint appointment at the University of Mumbai. So his research area is in development economics and public policy, focusing on the role of gender and social context, social nuance on policy. So without further ado, Shagata, take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay. So let me start. So actually, let me start by telling you a story. Now, the picture that you see here in this on your slide is that of a fresh market in Chennai, India. Now, in this market, there are many fruit vendors. What's interesting about these fruit vendors is that every morning they take a daily loan of 1,000 Indian rupees from the local money lenders, and they pay them back every night 1,047. Now, this means that the interest rate charged on this loan is 4.7% per day. If you do a back of the envelope calculation, it'll imply that an equivalent to a $5 loan, if it goes unrepaid for a year, leaves a debt of 100 million. Now, this story is taken from Abhishek Banerjee and Esther Duflo's book, The Poor Economics, and it highlights a very important point that a major constraint for the poor is the lack of access to formal credit. And indeed, it's not just unique to these fruit vendors of Chennai. As Dean Karlan writes in his book, More Than Good Intention, over 2.5 billion people, that's more than 1/3 of the world's population, live on less than $2 per day and remain unbanked. And it is under this background that microfinance has emerged as an alternative tool to rethink banking for the poor. The microfinance movement started back in the 70s with Professor Yunus and the Grameen Bank, and has been extremely popular since then in the development world. The number of microfinance clients has increased from 7.6 million in 1997 to 137.5 million in 2010, and that number has expanded rapidly in the past decade. Now, one of the major reasons for such rapid expansion of microfinance over the past few decades has been some of the lending innovations in microfinance. Now, in this paper, I'm going to focus on two popular lending innovations, group liability and gender targeting. Now, I'm going to talk about group liability in my experimental design section, but let's focus on gender targeting for now. Now, gender targeting has been, in fact, the focus of microfinance since its very inception. And over 80% of all microfinance clients worldwide are women. Now, that naturally brings the question to mind as to why women? It is typically explained in the literature by the double dividend of gender targeting of women in microfinance. The first is the idea of social dividend. This is the idea that providing microfinance loans to women will improve women's agency, women empowerment, and that will have positive spillovers in terms of investments in child education, nutrition, and health outcomes. The second aspect, which is of direct relevance to this paper, is that of economic dividend. This is the idea that even if an MFI does not care about social dividend, it's still good business to give loans to women because they have high repayment rates. And this conventional wisdom was formally stated in the World Bank report of 2008 that women are better credit risks than men in microfinance. Now that brings me to my research question. My first research question is to test this conventional wisdom. Are women really better borrowers in microfinance? Does gender targeting generate higher repayment rates for the microfinance institutions. Now, having posed this question, I wanted to take the literature one step forward by trying to understand that if there does exist a gender difference among microfinance borrowers, then what drives that gender difference in behavior? Are women wired naturally and fundamentally different than men to be better borrowers? Or is it the social context in which men and women operate that motivate their behavior? Now, if you just spend a second thinking about these questions intuitively, it becomes very evident that the second question is relatively more tricky to answer. Because how am I going to get a variation in social context that will allow me to answer this question? Now, as it turns out, the answer lies here. As you can see, this is in the northeastern part of India. And within this circled region, I have set up my lab in the field. Now, the reason I've chosen this particular region is because two very interesting indigenous societies live in this region. To the left of the border lives the Khasis in the Khasi hills of Meghalaya, and to the right of the border lives the Karbis in Karbi Anglong in Assam. As you can see, they live very close to each other, but these societies are also very similar in other aspects. The Khasis and the Karbis share the same genetic background and appear to be close kin based on genetic analysis. They are also similar in terms of their broad socioeconomic conditions, as both are indigenous agricultural societies. They are also both either Christians or they follow their indigenous religion, which is nature worshiping. And both fall under the category of scheduled tribes, which refers to indigenous population in India. So in terms of the genetic background, their primary occupation, their religion, these two societies are quite comparable to each other. But there is a big difference between the two societies, and that is in terms of gender relations. The Karbis are a patrilineal society, while the Khasis are a matrilineal society. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me list out the salient differences between the two societies. Now, the Karbi society is a traditional patriarchal society where men calls most of the shots. In particular, men inherit and control property. In contrast, in the Khasi society, men do not inherit property, women do. In fact, the youngest daughter gets the family property as opposed to the eldest son in the Karbi society. Also, in the Karbi society, after marriage, the wife moves to the husband's house, takes care of the husband's family, but is not allowed to own any property. In contrast, in the Khasi society, they follow what is called a matrilocal system of marriage, in which after marriage, and particularly for the youngest daughter, the husband moves to the wife's house, but do not own any property. So because of these gender and social norms, the Karbi women have very little bargaining and decision-making power, whereas the Khasi women have substantial decision-making power. Now, I spent quite a few months in these villages conducting my experiments and talking to local people, and I came to know that some of these Khasi men have actually started a men's right movement because they feel that women have too much power in the society. Now, that's rather unusual if you think about the gender relations in India and much of the developing world, but it's particularly interesting for my research because it allows me to exploit this natural variation across the otherwise comparable two societies. And the way I do it is by conducting the same microfinance experiments in these two societies. So in my experiment, I give my subjects at the beginning of the experiment 20 Indian rupees, which they have to invest either in Project X or Project Y. Project X yields a return of 60 rupees with a probability of 5/6 in case of success, and Project Y yields a return of 160 rupees with a 0.5 probability. Now you can think about X as the low risk, low return project, and Y as the high risk, high return project. Now, in the event of a failure, both the projects yield a return of 0, and in that case, the individual subject cannot repay the loan. Now, this is called an involuntary or a non-strategic default. On the other hand, if their projects are successful, then individual subjects have another choice to make, which is whether to repay the loan or to default strategically. Now, to give an overview of my microfinance games, I have 268 subjects in total, and each subject is randomly assigned to one of the two microfinance games, an individual game and a group liability game. In an individual game, each individual subject is given a loan. They decide whether to invest it in project X or Y. And if successful, they decide whether to repay the loan or default strategically. Now, as long as they repay the loan, they keep getting loan again in the next round of the experiment and keep making money in the experiment. The subjects are told that there are multiple rounds, but they do not know the exact number of rounds. Now, in the group liability game, two individuals of the same gender and belonging to the same society are randomly matched to form a group. And the group debt is split equally among the two randomly matched group members. The group liability here implies that if one group member defaults, the other must repay the entire debt. And as long as at least one of them repay, both the group members receive loan in the next round and they can keep making money in the experiment. Now you can imagine that this gives a strategic incentive to both the group members to sort of free ride on their partner. But if both of them do that and both of them strategically default, then the group as a whole defaults and neither of the group members receive any further loan during the experiment and cannot make any more money. So that's the broad structure of the experiment. Now, what else can matter? Now, of course, what I'm primarily interested is looking at the effect of gender and society on repayment behavior. But of course, individual characteristics can also matter. So after the microfinance experiment, I have my subjects fill out a questionnaire for which they're paid 50 rupees. And I collect these data on individual characteristics that I control for in my formal regression. The other thing that can matter are risk attitudes. So I implement an incentivized investment risk task to control for subjects' risk attitudes. And the subjects are not told about this task until at the very end, before they do it. The subjects choose how much of their earned endowment of 50 rupees from the questionnaire to invest in a risky lottery, which yields a return of 3 times the amount invested with a 50% probability in case of success and 0 otherwise. Now, in this setting, the lower the amount invested by the subjects, the more risk averse they are. So what do I find? Now, what I find is that I first start by looking at the pool data together. And there I find that the default rate for women is slightly less of that for men, but it's not statistically significant. But this doesn't give us the entire story. For that, we need to look at the two societies separately. But before doing that, let us take a second to think about what we should expect to find. Now, if it is indeed the case that women are inherently and naturally better borrowers, then we should expect to see the same pattern, roughly the same pattern, across the two societies. Now, what I find is exactly opposite of that. I find that in the patrilineal society, women default significantly less than men, but in the matrilineal society, women default significantly more than men. So I find a reversal of gender effect across the two societies. And in fact, this graph tells us that the matrilineal men behaves more like the patrilineal women, and the matrilineal women behaves somewhat like the patrilineal men. Now, this is suggestive evidence for the fact that it's not necessarily men or women per se, but the dominant gender in a society that behaves in a particular way. Now, next, I'm interested to look at the behavioral channels. Now, recall in my experiment, the subjects have 2 choices to make, the project choice and the repayment choice. So now I look at 2 of them separately. I start with the risky project choice, and here I find that in the patrilineal society, the women invest in risky projects significantly less than men, and the difference is quite substantial. In the matrilineal society, the difference is much less, and the significance is also weak. Now, next I look at strategic default, and I find the same pattern that in the patrilineal society, women default significantly less than men, whereas in the matrilineal society, women default significantly more than men. And in fact, here you can see that the matrilineal women not only strategically defaults more than matrilineal men, but even more than patrilineal men. So they are the highest strategic defaulter group among all. And finally, I look at risk attitudes, and I find that in the patrilineal society, women are significantly more risk averse than men, while in the matrilineal society, men and women have about the same risk attitudes. Now, this story that comes out from the graphs is supported in the formal regression analysis Here, if you look at the interaction term between female and matrilineal, that coefficient in red highlights the heterogeneity across the two societies. Also, I find that group liability significantly increases investments in risky projects as well as strategic default. And finally, I find that risk attitudes are a significant predictor of their subject's project choice, but not of strategic default. Now, in the paper, I do a bunch of robustness checks, which in the interest of time here, I won't be able to describe. But let me quickly mention some of them. So what I do is I look at the first round data only to sort of isolate the dynamic effects of the game. I also estimate a bivariate probit model where I estimate the project choice and the repayment choice jointly, because these two may not be independent. And I find about the same result as the one you can see here. And I also test for robustness of my sample. So I conduct the same experiment in a mainstream patrilineal society in a neighboring state of West Bengal, and then compare them with the matrilineal Khasis. And I find similar results as I showed you here. And I also find the same reversal of gender effect across the two societies. So that gives me confidence that my findings and my results are robust to specifications as well as my choice of particular sample. So what can we take away from the results? The key takeaway is, of course, the reversal of gender effect across the societies. My findings suggest that in the patrilineal society, women are better credit risks, but the pattern reverses in the matrilineal society, which is a new insight that comes from this experiment. Also, matrilineal women are more likely to invest in risky projects and default strategically than patrilineal women. Therefore, women do not behave homogeneously, it depends on what kind of society they come from. And finally, about policy implications, my findings, of course, have direct policy implications for microfinance policy. And in that aspect, my findings suggest that women do have lower default on average, although a universal gender targeting might be suboptimal in the presence of heterogeneity across societies, as we just saw. But come to think of it, my findings have implications beyond just microfinance policy. That's because women are the targeted agents for most development policies, from conditional cash transfers to health and education to financial inclusion. And so the broad policy implication of my findings is for development policies in general, and that is to highlight the importance of social context. My study underscores the point that context matters, and one should be careful about generalizing a policy simply because it has worked in a particular context. Policymakers should take into consideration the heterogeneity and the social context to design better targeted policies. And I think my time is just about to end, so I'll stop here, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shagata. So our discussant for the second paper is Dean Karlan from Northwestern.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I really enjoyed reading the paper and learning from it. Thank you, Shagata, for putting this together and all the work. This is, it was fun to learn about, and I can only imagine it must have been fun to do as well. I'm envious of the time you got to spend there and learn about the difference between these societies. So, I have a few thoughts for you. One, just in the kind of the biggest picture, is that, this is, it's been a while since I gave a lot of microcredit talks, but I always used to open up by talking, whenever I get into gender, by saying, look, we don't know why. I have one slide with like 9 reasons why women repay more than men or as equal. But like, I've never seen a single data set from a single lender in my entire career, which I guess I'm getting old, is a while now, in which men paid more than women, had a higher default, had higher repayment rates, right? Sometimes it's equal, sometimes women higher. And then there's, lots of stories and hand waving that people do. And we don't, it's not something that is very well settled in the literature. And I think your final point is spot on. Obviously there isn't a simple answer, right? That's, and so, but it's work like you're doing here that can help shed light on these important issues. So that's my, that's why I was excited about this project. My second my second kind of overall big picture kind of rah-rah point is that this is, I think, a great example of when to use lab experiments in the field. And I'm saying this perhaps as a compliment to you, while at the same time, maybe I'm saying it in a negative way to a lot of other things. But a lot of times I see lab experiments in the field that just don't really feel like they're testing something that needed the field. And then it just introduces all this messiness and noise, and it's just like, and your only upside is to say, oh, but it's with real people. And I'm like, and or it's to get a point estimate, but I'm not sure what to, you know, and a point estimates from the lab experiments are usually useless. We care about comparative statics, you know. You run a lab, you know, you can't do anything with the fact that 37% defaulted on your loans in your game. That doesn't mean anything, 37%. What we care about is that it's higher for this group than that group, and that's it. We're not going to go nuts with the 37%. And so that's what I love about your papers. You have, you know, very clear cultural questions that you're answering that you could not do this in a lab in Georgia. Like, that would be stupid. This is exactly when we should be doing lab experiments in the field, is when you want to tease out very specific theories, mechanisms, and controlled questions to get it. Okay, so that's, having said that, I think this seems like a great opportunity to do something which I don't think I've seen, which is a really nice combination, right? Where you could also, and this is something that I think this would be a great contribution methodologically to the space, if you were to have, and this would be a fairly different paper. This is not like a simple, like, add a couple paragraphs, but, you know, run a survey as well and ask people, like, hey, have you taken loans? What happened? Do you have peers that took out loans? What happened? Did you repay? Did you default? What happened? Just ask, you know, can be a quantitative, qualitative kind of survey. See what you get from that. Does it line up? Is it shedding insight? Is, you know, triangulate some. And then an extension on that too, that I think in this particular context you could do, which is also something which we don't usually do as development economists, but other disciplines sometimes I've heard push on us to do this. And I've always thought in most contexts it makes no sense, but I think in yours it does, which is share your results back with some of your participants. Say, okay, I just learned that, because the community, the neat thing is that these communities are so close. This would be a stupid idea if your communities were nowhere near each other.
Right.
I'm assuming they're aware of each other's existence. Is that right?
Of course. Yeah.
So if they're aware, show your results to the community. Say, hey, you guys are doing 37%. They did 12%. What do you think of that? Help me understand that. And vice versa. And see what they say in a focus group kind of context where you can actually get a conversation going. And again, that's not something that we as economists have a habit of doing, but I think that would be awesome as a contribution and a methodological innovation that you can push and others can follow. And so don't, you know, do something new there. And that would be a really cool way of writing the paper. Okay, so those are a few ideas. So now I'm going to rattle off some other stuff that's less big picture. Main thinking, I get a little bit of angst whenever I see a paper that says matriarch, patriarch. And you had a nice little slide that said all the differences, and I get it. But in my limited experience dealing with that particular kind of issue, I've never found it to be quite so black and white. There's heterogeneity in terms of people's you know, adherence to whatever those norms are. There's other factors that are just not as simple. And so it's not really that binary. And so it always makes me nervous seeing that. They're also, sorry, I'm looking over at my notes over here. I didn't put a deck together, but I have notes written down. Let me put it right here so I'm not like looking away. There could be correlated omitted variables. You know, matriarch, patriarch can be correlated with access to alternative credit, and has nothing to do with matriarch, patriarch. It just has to do with this third thing, which is both correlated matriarch, patriarch distinction for some reason, and also then driving your result and their experience. And so it could have literally nothing to do with it. And so this is where you want to, ideally, some of these predictions might be good to test within the matriarch, patriarch, within each culture, each community. Some of these things might be driven by access to credit. And so if you have complementary data, then you can see within your matriarch, do you find variation that lines up with certain market access things. The risk aversion result is super nice. That was a very nice result. It's exactly the kind of thing that I was describing up front when I said this is like a good example of what's great about this project and using a lab in this way. I have one fear is, if I understood correctly, is that you did it at the end where they were taking their earned endowment money and then that's what they then get to gamble with. And so that seems like that's going to be driven by whether they've been successful or not and taken risks before or not. And I would think you want that to be just a completely independent draw, which of course will have influence from the others, but still you don't make it so that it's actually that, I mean, that tied in. This might fall into the ideas for further work, whereas the other things I was describing I think would be great to have in here, but for further work, although I have a little bit of fear, I have this old paper called Microfinance Games, where we did games of this nature, and we did too many permutations, and I remember having a really difficult time figuring out what our coherent message is out of this. Having said that, you do have a little extra variations that would be nice. Your gender, your partner's gender, varying that is what's driving it. Is it your gender or is it who you're playing with? So we have no way of knowing. That wasn't separated out. So randomizing gender mismatch match and randomizing whether you know your partner's gender or not would be some really obvious extensions. Similarly, the whole monitoring access side of this, Greg Fisher has a paper that uses a game just like this, also in India. It's published in Econometrica that you should dig in on, and deals a lot with a lot of the issues you're dealing with, not the matriarch, but all the parts about contract theory. Love the inclusion of microcredit experience in this. That's another example of where lab experiments in the field do need to do, they need to bring in the realities from the field. That's the whole point, right? So we shouldn't just treat people like just monolithic beasts and just say, well, we have 742 participants and let's go. So the fact that you have some evidence of their experience is good, but I feel like you might want to give us a little bit more information there. Was their experience on group or individual liability? Had they ever defaulted? Were they current borrowers or ever borrowers? And did they ever have default? Were they in a group that had default? Maybe they were good, but they had groups members that defaulted. That's all kind of experiences they're bringing to the table that could influence how they play this. And also, I don't know that these communities either, but savings groups, ROSCAs, ASCAs, things of this nature might be at play. So there might be other experiences with groups seeing other people default that influence the way they then make decisions in this context and seeing that. Okay, so that's, so I would also think that some of your tests are actually exactly some of the tests that we had in our Peru games, the Microfinance Games paper, and the same with Greg Fisher's. And so some of those comparative statics would actually be useful to see how does it map to the comparative statics you see. And again, I would ignore point estimates. There's no way to say 38% defaulted and Greg Fisher found it was 47. Like, what do you do with that? Nothing. But the comparative statics might be useful just for hypotheses that were rejected or supported. One thing that was not clear to me is what when you were having controls and when not for individuals. On one level, of course, it's always nice to see some controls in there because there's some obvious thing. Oh, maybe it's omitted variables. On the other hand, I'm not sure you want them in there because, like, what if the matriarch patriarch aspect of society is leading women to have certain wealth and income in one society, not the other, and then you put in a control for wealth or income or jobs or something like this, and then you're altering your estimate on the other. And so, like, ultimately, it's endogenous, right? There's no perfect solution. You don't have instruments, but I would think just show it both ways at a minimum and tell us what the controls are. Let us know what's loading up on them. Would be nice. I one comment that I added when at the very end when you said the policy implications. I would actually think the policy implication might be the other way. Like, we probably want more risk taking. Most micro lending organizations have repayment rates that are, I think, I've always felt too high. When you have a bank that is getting 99% of their loans back and yet charging those interest rates in these markets with this much problems, like, that means they're not taking on enough risk. So if there's something that is being done that can actually get people to take on more risk, That's probably a good thing, and let the banks take care of that. You know, ideally there's a way of insuring it, etc. And then, so those are the main points. I have 4 little tweaks on motivation to add for you. One is, you know, you mentioned at some point that the microcredit RCTs have not found impact on female power. One could argue that the mere access, the mere labor supply increase is power, and the metrics that I've used and others have used are just really bad metrics, and so we're not picking up impacts, but it's because these are not easy to measure things, and so let's just look at the process. So I just want to point that out, that there is that argument there. I also would hesitate to, you do a lot of framing of wired naturally versus social. It's kind of the, you know, the classic evidence of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Did I say that backwards? I'm not sure you want to really go down the path of like getting into like biology on it. It's not your area. It's not my area. And, you know, just say you're testing these social stuff and leave it at that. I love the opening story for what it's worth, because I've done research exactly on that. The Banerjee do flow stuff that you refer to is based on a paper by Bindu Ananth, Sendil Mullainathan, and me called 3 Anomalies that we never published anywhere. So it's probably not easily findable. But where we documented this compounding interest thing, and then the published paper we did do where we paid off debt of it might have been that very veggie market that you were taking that photo from. But I'm not sure that that works. I wouldn't cite that stuff here. It's not like, that's all about like, my God, why are these interest rates so high? Why aren't these women saving anything? Because if they could save out of this, then just a little bit every day. You know, the big thing we did in that 3 Anomalies paper was calculate, like, in 62 days, saving, just cutting back 1 cup of tea a day, you can get out of debt. And that was the like, so what's wrong with this? But that's not about women versus men and repayment rates. So that's it. Thank you very much, though. I loved reading it, loved learning from it. And feel free to email me later if anything I've said here, if I talk too fast or just blah blah, you know, feel free to reach out. Happy to talk one-on-one as well.
Great, thank you, Dean. We actually have past 11 o'clock, so we're moving into the after party. So we have up to half an hour of after party. Basically, anybody who had questions during the presentation or the discussion but didn't get a chance to ask, please feel free to hang out and ask your questions. And so the way it works, it's in the webinar mode, which means that the participants cannot talk unless you raise your hand. So if you have a question or you have comments, please go ahead and in the participant button, if you click, you can raise your hand and we will let you talk.
Jan, sorry, just a second. Is there time that I could quickly respond to some of the points that?
Yeah, of course. Made? Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. I tried to keep notes, but I might have missed something. And if you're fine, if you could just email me those pointers, that would be fantastic. I'll write to you. Now, just quickly,
they are cryptic, so I can tell them, but then we might want to just talk. We can just talk.
Sure. Sounds good. So it's not a coincidence that that the design and all is so similar to your Microfinance Games paper, because that was one of the motivating papers that I read as a PhD student and helped quite a bit into this into this paper. Actually, the project choice part came largely from the Microfinance Games experiments there. So yeah, that was and yeah, you're right. That could be interesting to sort of look at them. Insofar as looking at what you said about going back and looking at some of these maybe doing a survey with these societies and getting more information, that's absolutely I think great suggestion, was always on my mind. Now I did try to get during my experiments, I did try to get some of these informations, like whether they take what kind of loan they took, whether they were in a group loan, and etc. What were the interest rates, kind of stuff. But that the data came out to be very messy because some of it got lost in translation, and so I didn't use it. But I've got a grant from Georgetown University to go back there and work with a faculty at Georgetown, where I'm hoping to collect more information and get more insight on that. So that's absolutely on my list, I think. And in terms of I'm trying to think which ones I respond. So in terms of the covariates, you said that's absolutely possible that there are omitted things that I cannot. That's probably driving the effect in lots of directions. So that's why I think the controls with and without controls is something that I'm going to absolutely be looking at and doing. But and that's why I try to not sort of say that it's sort of a causal effect, because of course I don't know. All I see is sort of a correlation between what kind of society they come from and what is the kind of behavior that we find. In fact, the point about risk taking on the policy implication is absolutely right. I maybe I didn't quite explicitly write it in the paper, but we do see that. I mean, of course, in the microfinance literature, there is this problem that you're kind of rewarded if you take low risk, and in your paper also you have said that people take less than optimum amount of risk, and that's kind of rewarded by the MFI. So here we see that the matrilineal women are actually taking more risky projects, which could be a good thing in terms of long run gains and things like that. So so that could in itself be sort of a policy implication to sort of look at particular type of women who are more likely to invest in risky projects and not just set up a vegetable stand, things like that, low risk low return projects. So that part I think is absolutely spot on, because the data tells that in a lot of ways, but I do not make that point explicitly. Yeah, so I'll stop here because I don't want to take up all the time, but it'll be great to sort of chat afterwards. And thank you so much.
All right, so any questions from the audience?
We have a question in the Q&A.
Okay.
For Shagata. Maybe I can read it. In microfinance situations, sometimes those who cannot pay back their credits might get into difficult situation, even jail. Thus, I was wondering about the possible effects of higher risk-taking on the society.
Yeah, sure. So I think, Dean Karlan's here, so he's probably in a much better position to answer that question. But I'll give my understanding to it. It sort of flows from the point that we were making about risk taking. That's of course that's true. I mean, there's a lot of getting into jail doesn't happen so much because just the fact of chasing these people and putting through the judiciary process, the loan size is just not big enough for MFIs to pursue that. But there's a lot of other types of sort of social shaming and lots of other things that happen, for which microfinance got pretty bad press at about a decade ago. But I think what Dean was also trying to say here is that we actually have the opposite problem, which is the fact that we have extremely low amount of risk taking, that people are just taking the loans and doing jobs which are very low risk, low return. The downside of that is because it's also low return, that is not necessarily generating enough revenue for their business to foster and taking them out of poverty. So in some sense, they're sort of getting by, but that kind of story that we hear, microfinance completely changing life, is there are anecdotes, but that's not true for the average microfinance lender. And perhaps slight amount of more risk taking, of course not beyond a point, probably wouldn't be a bad idea. But microfinance institutions are very skeptic of that. There's a paper by Rohini Pandey and Erica Field where they sort of try to give incentives to people to take more sort of long-term decisions by changing the duration of repayment, and that increases very slightly the default rate And right after the study, the MFI in Kolkata in India said that we are not going to do that because they don't even, MFIs don't even want like, 0.5% increase in their default rate because they think all hell will break loose. Of course, things have drastically changed because of the pandemic. Now we don't know what's going to happen, but yeah, sorry. Dean, if you have something to add, please feel free to.
No, I think you said it perfectly. There's anecdotes on both sides, but pro and con. Average evidence doesn't usually pan out to support the negative or the positive, but more on the positive than the negative. Yeah, jail is rare. Jail, that's I think that's highly unusual.
So one question I have for Shagata is the norms that you mentioned in the paper, which is so it will be interesting to know what kind of behavioral norms are considered socially appropriate, I guess, in the matrilineal society. In one of the graphs that you showed, I think women and men are about equally risk averse or risk loving, right? So, but you don't see the reversal. So in patriarchal societies, we tend to see in lots of different contexts, men are more risk taking. So, one, if you go back to collect more data, so there's one norm elicitation protocol by Krupka and Weber, which I thought was really nice because it's third party norm elicitation. And so I'm wondering whether, it is socially acceptable, judged by most people in matriarchal societies matrilineal societies to default sometimes.
No, that's a great question, and that reminds me of the point that Dean also raised and I didn't respond to, is about these norms and these two societies. Absolutely, it's true that these two societies are not sort of kind of like a mirror image and completely walls upside down, as some of the initial studies in this literature has sort of, I think, oversold the idea. It's of course not that. It's much more nuanced, and there are a lot of aspects in which they're similar, and some aspects on which in terms of inheritance and financial decision making in which they're different. So you're right. In the data we find that in the patrilineal society we find what other studies have found, which is that women are more risk averse. But in the matrilineal society that kind of goes away, and it's not 100% clear as to why that happens. But I have sort of made some sort of suggestive suggestions in the paper, which I want to go back and test with data. Is the fact that some of the things that came out is that in the patrilineal society, finance is a domain for the men, because women are not allowed to own property or make financial decisions. Their husbands always do it. Whereas in the matrilineal society, because women and particularly the youngest daughter inherit the property, but it's not that women are the ones who are taking all the shots. The men are still involved, because in that society the uncle is still the custodian, although the youngest girl is getting it. So in that case, finance is rather a shared domain.
Okay.
And there are papers to that suggest that risk-taking is also correlated with familiarity with the domain. So the more familiar you are in a particular domain, you're more likely to take risk in that domain. And in the matrilineal society, men and women are both equally sort of, it's a shared domain, finance, whereas in the patrilineal society, it's largely the domain for men and not for women. So that could possibly explain why we are getting what we are getting.
Interesting. Yeah. So in other words, if you let them practice more, you might wipe out the gender gap. Let women in the patrilineal society practice more of the risk taking. It doesn't have to be the real financial decision making. I remember Jin Tsai has a paper in the AER or the AEJ several years ago about insurance take-ups in rural China, and what she did was to essentially do a hypothetical scenario with the villager. And the ones who experienced the hypothetical scenario, a die rolling game, where they say, oh, you know, what does a 10% chance of getting a drop mean? You roll the die 10 times and you might have some realizations. And these people who experience this abstract hypothetical scenario are actually more likely to take up social insurance. Yeah.
I have a quick question for Boon Han. So in your groups, all members made decisions in terms of their effort choices, and that some of them were assigned to be decision makers and some of them stayed as group members. Later on, you elicited their beliefs.
Yeah.
And in one of the treatments, they did make a decision about punishment or giving a bonus to the decision maker. So did you control for those members' own effort choices, and do you see any impact coming from that on their beliefs or punishment or bonus decisions?
Yep. So that's a really good question. So we have controlled for the members' own effort choices in our analysis of prior beliefs. So we essentially see some form of consensus effect. So if members themselves chose high effort when they were placed in the position of a DM under a strategy method, they were more likely to believe that their DM is going to choose high effort. But we have not yet looked at the results for updating behavior and payoff adjustments because this is a form of heterogeneity that we have yet to explore. That said, in our previous work where we had an experiment where members are passive, so similar in this environment with similar to our treatment NA, we did look at heterogeneity in terms of attribution biases, and we found that the attribution biases where the good outcomes were attributed to luck, bad outcomes there were no bias in the attribution of outcomes, that bias was driven by subjects who themselves chose low effort as DMs. And that would result was in that paper. So it will be something that we would need to look at next, which is whether or not we also find heterogeneity in terms of both attribution biases, so in terms of beliefs, as well as payoff adjustments, depending on the subject's own effort choices.
Perfect.
And I guess related to that, I just wanted to also respond to Christine's one of Christine's earlier comments was in our experiment, we also, so what I didn't manage to cover in the talk was the fact that we actually had multiple investment choices that they have to make. And what we actually varied across the multiple investment choices were the parameters in terms of payouts as well as costs of the investments. Some of which were leading to a zero effect, which is if the investment was unsuccessful, the members actually walk away with zero payoffs. And the variation had both the zero effect, but we also vary such that theoretically, the level of, I guess, altruism required of the DMs is also different. So in some investment choices, the DMs need to be really, really altruistic to be able to be incentive to choose high effort. So that was a variation that we also had across investment tasks that we have yet to exploit in our data. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay, if not, so we're going to resume in a week, and let's thank the speakers and the discussants for 2 excellent talks and discussions. And so we look forward to seeing everyone in a week. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care and stay safe, everyone.
Thanks.